On a cool afternoon in 2019, construction workers began taking apart a crane above one of Seattle's busiest streets. It was supposed to be brought down in a controlled and methodical process, but as work progressed, something wasn't right. Decisions were made, and high above the city, the structure was no longer what it seemed. Minutes later, it would collapse and lives were lost. But was it the weather or something else? It was the 27th of April 2019. Seattle, in the middle of a construction boom, had more cranes than anywhere else in the United States. One of those cranes was a 300-foot tower crane rising above the intersection of Mercer Street and Fairview Avenue. It had been in place since 2017 for the construction of the new Google campus. However, on this day, the crane was to be dismantled. The operation involved several companies, including GLY Construction, Morrow Equipment, the crane's owner, Northwest Tower Crane Service, responsible for setup and dismantling, and Omega Morgan, assisting with the removal. A smaller mobile crane was positioned nearby to assist with the dismantling. Dismantling a large crane is carried out piece by piece. Workers secure the top section, remove the connecting bolts, and lift it away with a smaller second crane. The process is repeated until the entire structure is gone. The weather on this day was overcast with unsettled conditions moving through the area. Winds had been forecast and steady gusts were pushing through the site. Before operations began, supervisors involved in the dismantling met to discuss the day's task, with a specialist qualified technician from Morrow Equipment present to ensure the procedures were carried out correctly. However, during this meeting, the crane manufacturer's dismantling procedures were not reviewed. Work began with the removal of the jib, or the main arm. Attention then shifted to the rear arm, the counter jib. This housed the motors, the electronics, and the counterweights. After this, the cab assembly mounted at the top of the tower. However, something wasn't right. The cab assembly had become stuck when they attempted to remove it, bringing the whole operation to a halt. But instead of waiting for the problem to be solved and losing time, attention turned elsewhere. Crews began working on other parts of the structure in ways that, at the time, did not immediately stand out. The smaller crane assisting with the dismantling was operating under strict limits. Its onboard wind gauge recorded gusts around 20 miles per hour. Only certified for winds up to 13.5 miles per hour, work was once again brought to a halt. Then, at 3:26 p.m., a 45-mile-per-hour gust tore through South Lake Union, lifting sandbagged street barricades and sending them skidding down Mercer Street. It was in this gust that everything changed. Captured on a vehicle dashcam, the 300-foot crane suddenly gave way. The midsection buckles, collapsing onto the building below, while the top part of the structure, including the operator's cab, spills onto Mercer Street, crushing 6 vehicles. 4 people are killed. 2 iron workers who had been working on the crane, and 2 people in the cars beneath it. In the immediate aftermath, the cause of the collapse wasn't clear. Investigators from the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries were called in, alongside multiple companies involved in the project. Their task was to determine how a 300-foot crane could fail so catastrophically. Early theories pointed to the wind. Gusts had been sweeping through the site all afternoon, and in the moment the crane fell, it seemed like the obvious explanation. But as the investigation unfolded, attention shifted elsewhere. Over the following months, investigators pieced together what had happened. They examined the crews working on the day, their actions on site, and how closely they had followed the manufacturer's dismantling procedures. Through their investigation and interviews with those involved, a clearer picture began to emerge, and while the wind played its part, it became apparent that the actions of the work crews that day was the real culprit behind the tragedy. Investigators found that on the day of the tragedy, when the cab assembly became stuck, work on the crane had come to a halt. But instead of waiting for that critical step to be resolved, crews shifted their focus elsewhere, and in doing so, astonishingly, began removing pins and connectors from the lower sections of the crane. In effect, dismantling the structure out of sequence to save time. Investigators determined that more than 50 pins and connectors, critical components holding the crane's mast together, had been prematurely removed, compromising its stability. And when the wind had hit, it didn't cause the collapse, it exposed it. This practice, while shocking, wasn't unheard of. In the construction industry, removing a certain number of pins in advance had, in some cases, become a shortcut, a way to speed up the dismantling process and save time. While none of them should have been removed in advance, what happened here went well beyond the shortcuts often seen in the industry. With those connections gone, the structure had been fundamentally weakened. In the wake of the investigation and its findings, regulators moved to take action. The Washington State Department of Labor and Industries issued fines against multiple companies involved in the dismantling of the crane. Morrow Equipment, the crane's owner, had approved the removal of pins in violation of recommended procedures and was cited for a willful, serious violation and fined $70,000. GLY Construction, the general contractor on the project, was fined $25,200 for failing to ensure proper oversight and account for hazardous conditions. Northwest Tower Crane Service, responsible for dismantling the crane, was fined $12,000 for failing to ensure the crews followed the manufacturer's procedures. In total, just over $107,000 in fines were issued, a figure that stood in stark contrast to the scale of the disaster. However, aside from the minor regulatory fines, the financial consequences extended far beyond. In 2022, a jury awarded $150 million in damages to the families of those killed, as well as 2 people injured in the collapse. The jury ultimately assigned 45% of the blame to Northwest Tower Crane Service, 30% to Omega Morgan, and 25% to Morrow Equipment. In the years that followed, changes were made to prevent a similar disaster. Washington State introduced stricter rules governing the operation, assembly, and dismantling of tower cranes. Under the new regulations, contractors are now required to obtain a permit, follow manufacturer procedures, and undergo safety reviews before approval is granted. The changes were introduced to ensure that shortcuts like those seen on that day could no longer be taken, and honestly, it's hard for me to understand why this wasn't already the law. That's all for today's video. If you found value in it, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. To watch my video about a hot air balloon accident involving more serious negligence, you can click the link on screen. And as always, thanks for watching.